On a Thursday morning in October of 1817, the Wiltshire County Advertiser ran a notice that Prudence Ashvale read 4 times before she understood that it was about her. She was sitting in the small morning room off the east corridor, a room she had loved since childhood, where the light came in sideways through the old oak tree and lay in long strips across the floor. When Nettie brought the paper in with the breakfast tray, Nettie was 17 and not yet skilled at hiding her feelings. She set the paper down without a word, which was wrong. Nettie always had a word. So Prudence looked at the paper before she looked at the toast. The notice was in the 3rd column, midway down the page. It read, "From Ashvale Manor, Wiltshire, offered for service, 1 female seamstress, age 5 and 20, no family connections of note, plain in appearance and plainer in expectation, accustomed to quiet work and modest compensation, available immediately upon inquiry. Character references furnished upon request. Inquiries to the manor housekeeper." Nettie, standing by the window with her back to the room, made a small, strangled sound. Prudence read the notice again. Then she folded the paper, set it beside the toast she would not eat, and told Nettie that she needed an hour to herself and that Nettie should go help Mrs. Hewson with the linen. She went out to the south field. She walked to the old oak her father had planted the year she was born, and put her hand on its bark, which was rough and cold in the October morning. She stood there for a while. She did not cry. She had learned in the 3 years since her father's death that tears, like explanations, were most useful when there was someone present who deserved them. There was no one in that field, so she stood and breathed and thought about what the notice meant and what it would cost and what she was going to do about it. She had come back to Ashvale Manor 7 months ago, not as herself. Herself was not welcome, but as Prue Stokes, a seamstress from Bath, hired through an agent to repair the old curtains and bed hangings that the new owner had found too worn to ignore. She had cut her hair shorter than fashion allowed, and worn spectacles she did not need, and given herself a Surrey accent. She had practiced for a week in her lodgings before she could produce it without thinking. She had applied through a middleman and never met the current owner of the house directly. This was the house where she had grown up. This was the oak her father had planted. This was the morning room where her mother had read aloud on winter evenings, and the gallery where Prudence had learned to walk, and the study where Sir Robert Ashvale, baronet, magistrate, and the best man she had ever known, had died of pneumonia in December of 1814 after a January in which he had done something that no one had ever seen fit to tell her about. Barnaby Draxley had arrived at the funeral with a will in his coat pocket. He was Sir Robert's second cousin, a thin, restless man who smelled of card rooms and old obligations, and the will he produced was, as far as any court had been willing to determine, valid. It left Ashvale to Barnaby outright. Prudence received £200 and her mother's jewelry. She had known, with the particular clarity that comes from grief held very still, that something was wrong. Her father had told her not a month before his illness that his affairs were in order and that Ashvale would be hers. He had said it simply, the way he said everything, not as reassurance, but as fact. Her father did not reassure, he reported. But the will existed, and the courts accepted it, and Prudence was 22 years old with £200, and no legal standing to fight a document she could not disprove. Barnaby lasted 14 months before his debts outran even an estate. He sold Ashvale to a man called Crispin Morvell, new money, county gossip said, made in shipping, and used the proceeds to pay enough of what he owed that the rest could be argued about in London for years. He went to London with it and did not return. Crispin Morvell had arrived at Ashvale in the spring of 1816. He was 32, dark-haired, and quiet in a way that the county had decided was either coldness or contempt, because the county found it difficult to imagine a third option. He had not been born to houses like this one. He did not pretend otherwise. He walked through Ashvale on his first day with the measuring look of a man who knows exactly what things cost and is deciding which costs he can justify. He had looked at Prudence once. She was mending the gallery curtains, and she had felt that look land on her the way a hand lands flat on a map, taking account. Then he had looked at the portraits on the wall, and then he had gone to speak with Mr. Foss, the steward, and that was all. She had breathed again when he left the gallery. He had done nothing unkind in 7 months. She would give him that. He paid the staff on time. He kept the farms in repair. He had about him the air of someone working very hard at something they had not expected to be given, which Prudence, who knew something about that, could not entirely dislike. What she disliked was his fiancée. Selina Draxley was Barnaby's cousin. She was also beautiful, composed, and possessed of a memory like a bailiff's ledger. Every debt entered, none forgotten. She had come to Ashvale twice in the 7 months. Prudence had been there, and on her second visit, she had walked through the morning room, where Prudence was hemming a curtain, and paused in the doorway and looked at her for a moment too long. She had not said anything. She had smiled beautifully and moved on. Prudence had known then that she was discovered. She had not known what Selina would do about it. Now she knew. No family connections of note in a county that remembered Sir Robert Ashvale standing up in the magistrate's court at 50 years old and saying, without raising his voice, that a man's birth did not determine his honesty, and that he personally would accept nothing less than the same standard from the peerage as from the farmhand. Available immediately, meaning dismissed, meaning gone, meaning if she left the county now, whatever proof she had been searching for would leave with her, and Selina would become mistress of Ashvale, and it would be finished. Prudence stood at the oak tree until the cold worked through her coat. Then she went back inside. She had not finished her 7 months' work. The letters began arriving 2 days later. The first 3 came on Saturday afternoon, while Crispin was out riding. Mrs. Hewson brought them to Prudence in the sewing room with an expression that said clearly that she had suspected something for some time and would not be asking for an explanation until she was quite certain she wanted one. The letters were addressed to the seamstress at Ashvale Manor and had come from 3 different addresses in the county. Prudence opened them all. They were brief, courteous, and each one asked the same question. Was she, by any chance, Miss Prudence Ashvale, daughter of Sir Robert? She folded them and put them in her pocket and went back to work. On Monday 9 more came. On Wednesday, Crispin called Mr. Foss into his study and asked, in the particular quiet of a man who was controlling himself carefully, who had authorized the advertisement in the county paper. Mr. Foss said that he had not. Crispin went very still. He looked at the correspondence on his desk for a long moment. Then he sent a note to Selina's rooms requesting her company for tea. The note was polite. His handwriting was extremely deliberate. It was Nettie who told Prudence about the tea and about the voices heard afterward through the drawing-room door, neither of them raised, and both of them very cold. The letter from Henry Golt arrived on Thursday. It was addressed to Miss Prudence Ashvale, care of Ashvale Manor, Wiltshire, in the formal hand of a man accustomed to drafting documents that would outlast their authors. Mrs. Hewson brought it up herself and set it on Prudence's work table without a word. Then she sat down in the chair by the window, which she had never done in 7 months, and waited. Prudence read it twice. Then she looked up at Mrs. Hewson and said, "He has my father's true will." Mrs. Hewson looked out the window at the oak tree in the south field. She said, after a moment, I know whose hands built this house, Miss Ashvale. I've known since your 3rd week. I kept my mouth shut because I thought you'd a reason for the quiet, and it wasn't my place to trouble it." She smoothed her apron. "But I'll tell you this. If that letter means what it seems to mean, then you're not to face it alone. Not in this house." Galt arrived within 4 days. He was 60, silver-haired, and he came through the front doors of Ashvale with the purposeful stillness of a man who has been moving toward this particular room for 3 years and intends to waste no more time. He stood in the entrance hall, took one look at Prudence in her plain seamstress's dress, and removed his hat. "Miss Ashvale," he said, "not the fiction, her name." Crispin was present. He had asked to be. He stood by the window with his arms at his sides, and the face of a man who has recently learned that the ground beneath him belonged to someone else all along, and is deciding how to receive that. Galt sat down. Prudence sat across from him, and for the first time since her father's death, someone told her what Sir Robert Ashvale had actually done in January of 1814. The Marl River floods in the spring thaw. Most years it is manageable. In 1814 it was not. The stone bridge at the south crossing collapsed under the weight of the ice break, and Galt's coach went sideways into the current. The driver was killed in the fall. The footman could not reach him. Galt himself was trapped in 3 feet of rushing meltwater, so cold that it stopped being painful within the first minute and became something worse, an absence of sensation which is harder to fight because there is nothing to push against. Sir Robert had been riding home from the winter assizes. He heard the crash from the road. He came into the water without removing his coat, Galt said, without hesitating. I did not know him. I had seen him at the assizes, but we had no particular acquaintance. He did not ask my name before he came in after me. He simply came. He freed Galt from the wreckage. He carried him to the bank on ground that was ice and mud and broken timber. He rode to the nearest farmhouse, 1.5 miles in January cold, soaked to the skin, and returned with blankets and a cart. He stayed until Galt was indoors and warm and a physician had been sent for. I was confined to bed for 6 weeks, Galt said. Sir Robert was dead in 6. The room held that sentence. Outside the window, the oak tree moved in the October wind. He wrote to me once while he was ill, Galt continued. He said I was not to trouble myself about it. He said he would have done the same for anyone on that road, which I believe, and which made it harder somehow rather than easier. He looked at Prudence steadily. He asked one thing of me, he said. If anything should prevent him from settling his affairs properly, would I see to them for his daughter? He was making a new will. He had already told me the contents. He came to my office 2 weeks before he died and signed it in front of witnesses. He reached into his coat. I have been carrying it ever since. The document was 3 years old and entirely unambiguous. Ashvale and the whole of Sir Robert's estate to his daughter Prudence, unconditionally. Signed and witnessed on the 4th of November, 1814. Her father had been thorough. Her father was always thorough. The silence in the drawing room was the silence of several people adjusting their understanding of the past 3 years and finding the adjustment considerable. Crispin moved first. He looked at Selina, who had seated herself near the door and had not spoken once during Galt's account, and said, quietly, "The advertisement." Selina said, "I thought it best." "You knew who she was." "I suspected." "You advertised her from her own house," Crispin said, and his voice was not raised, and this was somehow more effective than if it had been. "You described her, in this county, as a woman of no family connections. You did it to make her leave before Galt could find her." Selina's composure was extraordinary. She held it for a full 10 seconds. Then she said that Prudence had entered the household under a false name, and that she could not be held responsible for. "No," Crispin said. "You're right, you can't." He looked at the fire for a moment. "But I can make certain you don't do it again." He did not look at her after that. He looked at Galt and said, "I'll have my solicitor begin the transfer tomorrow. The staff, those who wish to stay, I'd ask that they be considered, if Miss Ashvale is willing." Galt began to speak about the legal complications, about the timing, about the fact that Crispin had purchased in good faith and might reasonably expect a period of— "Morvell," Crispin said, "just the name. I'm not a lord. I've no title to protect, no reputation to manage in the way you mean. I bought a house that wasn't sold honestly. I'm returning it. That's the end of my accounting." He looked at Prudence then, briefly, with the same measuring look she had first seen in the gallery 7 months ago. Except that this time she could read what he was measuring. Not what Ashvale cost, what it was worth. He left the room to find his solicitor. Galt looked after him for a moment and then looked at Prudence, and neither of them said what they were thinking. She found her father's correspondence box on the second afternoon in the back of the old wardrobe in the study, behind a winter coat that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and cold air, which was the smell of her father. The box was rosewood, small enough to carry in both hands. Inside were letters, a promissory note she would later learn Barnaby had forged, and at the bottom, folded twice, a letter in her father's hand. It was addressed to her. It had been written in October of 1814, 2 months before he died. She carried it to the morning room and sat in the chair where the light came in through the oak tree. She read it once. Then she sat without moving for a long time. Her father had known he was ill before anyone else did. He had written to Galt. He had made the will. He had left her a letter saying he had done all he could and trusted it would be enough, and that she was the finest thing he had ever managed, and that Ashvale was hers and had always been hers, and that he was sorry he would not be there to say so in person. He had signed it, as he signed all his letters to her, "Your father, who is insufferably proud of you." This was the only time Prudence wept, not for what had been lost, most of it was coming back, but for the particular solitude of knowing that her father had done everything right, had trusted exactly the right person with exactly the right document, had written the right letter and put it in the right box, and had still not been able to reach her for 3 years, for the space between doing everything correctly and having it land. She wept, and then she dried her face with her sleeve, and then she went to speak with Mrs. Hewson about the household accounts, because there was work to be done and it was hers to do. The matter of Selina Draxley was handled quietly, as the most effective things usually are. Galt took the evidence of the forged original will to the proper authorities. Barnaby, located eventually in London, faced a proceeding that went very poorly for him. Selina could not be proven to have forged the document herself. She was not arrested. She was not publicly accused of anything that could be put neatly in a charge. She simply found that certain invitations had been withdrawn, that certain doors were slower to open, that when she entered a room, there was sometimes a small, telling pause before conversation resumed. She was not ruined in any legal sense. She was merely diminished, and the diminishing was gradual and permanent, and she felt every inch of it, and there was no one to appeal to because no one had done anything she could point at directly. She moved eventually to her family's property in Derbyshire. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was simply very still. The transfer of Ashvale was complete by November. The county received the news with the particular satisfaction of a place that has been waiting for a story to resolve properly, which is to say, loudly, thoroughly, and with a great deal of opinion about everyone involved. Henry Galt came back in the spring with his wife. He sat by the fire in the drawing room and looked at the portrait of Sir Robert that had been restored to its place above the mantel. Barnaby had put it in the attic. Prudence had brought it down herself on her first morning back as herself, and could not speak for a full minute. Then he said, he would have been so pleased, he would have been insufferable about it. Prudence said, he was always insufferable when he was right. Galt laughed, which broke something in the room that had been held tight for a long time, and Mrs. Hewson brought in tea, and they sat together in a house that was beginning again. Mrs. Hewson stayed on. It was never formally discussed. She simply remained, in the manner of someone who has decided that a particular place is worth the trouble of continuing. The matter was settled without words, which was how Mrs. Hewson preferred most matters. She ran the household with the same competence she had always had, and added to it a cheerfulness she had apparently been conserving for an occasion that justified it. She was asked once, many years later, what she considered the turning point. The moment she had known things would come right, she said without hesitating, when I brought her the letter and she read it, and she didn't cry and she didn't shout. She just said, he has the will, steady as a post. I knew then. Nettie married a farmer in the next parish and named her eldest daughter Prudence. The child grew up with her mother's gentle temper and, as everyone who knew both remarked, Sir Robert Ashvale's particular stubborn chin. Crispin Morvell did not go to Bristol. He had said he would. He had arranged lodgings and given notice to several business associates, and spent a week putting his affairs in order in the way of someone who is leaving and wishes to leave cleanly. And then he did not go. He took instead a small property 3 miles from Ashvale, a farm in the Marl Valley, that needed more work than it was perhaps worth, and threw himself into it with the energy of someone who has found, somewhat to his own surprise, a reason to stay in a county he had not expected to like. He was seen often enough on the Ashvale Drive that the village ceased remarking on it before the year was out. He sat at the magistrates' assizes every quarter, in the same seat Sir Robert had occupied for 20 years, and attempted, imperfectly and earnestly, to live up to it. The meeting at the oak tree happened in November, 3 weeks after the transfer was complete. Prudence walked the south field most mornings now, relearning it, reacquainting herself with every boundary, as though the land needed to know she was back. She found Crispin standing at the oak one morning, with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has come to say something, and is reconsidering how to say it. She stopped a few feet from him. He said, I wanted to and did not finish. She said, you gave back this house without being asked. It wasn't mine to keep. Most men would have found a way to argue otherwise. She looked at the oak. The bark was rough and cold under the morning light, the same as it always was. My father rode into a frozen river for a man he had never spoken to. He did not mention it afterward. He just rode home and never said a word about it. She looked back at Crispin. You returned an estate the day after Galt arrived. You made no speech. You set no conditions. You just did it and then tried to leave before anyone could make a fuss. She paused. He would have understood you completely. Crispin said, roughly, I should have, earlier in the summer, when I began to suspect. When you began to suspect, Prudence said, you confronted Selina, and when you knew, you acted. She let that sit between them for a moment. My father left me a letter. He wrote that Ashvale was mine and had always been mine, and that he trusted the world would eventually put it right. She looked at the field, at the pale autumn light lying flat across the grass. It took 3 years, but he wasn't wrong. The oak moved in the November wind. Somewhere in the south field, a crow called once and went quiet. Some time passed before either of them spoke again, and what was said does not need to be set down here, because it belonged only to them and to the field and to the particular quality of morning light that came through that oak tree, and had done for as long as anyone at Ashvale could remember. The advertisement, the notice that had run in the Wiltshire County Advertiser on a Thursday in October, describing a seamstress of no family connections available immediately from Ashvale Manor, was framed by Prudence in plain oak and hung in the small study where she worked, on the wall directly facing the desk, where no one who sat there could fail to see it. Visitors asked about it. She always answered the same way. She said, "It was the cruelest thing done to her, and the most useful. It brought Galt to her door. It brought a man who did not have to return this house to a room where his character was put to a question he had not expected, and he answered it honestly. It brought the story into the open, where it could be seen and set right. A woman who wished her gone had meant it to erase her, and it had instead written her name where all the county could read it, the name her father had trusted her to carry. She said, 'My father could not send for me. He was dead, and the dead cannot write letters. So a woman who wished me nothing good wrote one in his place, and it delivered everything he had meant for me to have.' She said, 'I was advertised as a woman of no connections, no family, no worth beyond the work of my hands. 400 letters arrived before the month was out. Not one of them agreed.